The air inside room 214 was thick with tension. Westbridge Academy, a school built on prestige and legacy, had seen its fair share of heated debates. But today was different. Today, the lesson wasn't just about ethics, it was personal. Ms. Whitmore, the sharp-tongued teacher known for pushing boundaries, had just crossed one. With a calculated smirk, she turned the classroom discussion toward Jordan Carter's mother. A fearless journalist, she didn't just question her work, she mocked it. The class chuckled. Jordan didn't. At first, he remained silent, but silence was a mistake, and when he finally spoke, his words left everyone speechless. The clock in room 214 ticked steadily, marking the slow passage of time as Ms. Whitmore paced in front of the class. The polished wood floors gleamed under the harsh white lights, and the neatly arranged desks reflected the discipline expected at Westbridge Academy. This wasn't just any school. It was an institution built on power, filled with students who carried last names that held weight in politics, finance, and media. Every lesson here was more than just academic. It was a rehearsal for the real world. A world where influence mattered more than truth. Jordan Carter sat near the middle, his notebook open, his pen idle between his fingers. He was used to this, being the outlier, the student who didn't come from old money or political legacies. His name didn't carry weight, but his mother's did. Celeste Carter, investigative journalist, relentless truth seeker, a woman who had built her career exposing corruption no matter the cost. And today, her name was about to be dragged through the mud. Ms. Whitmore had a reputation. She was the kind of teacher who relished in making students uncomfortable, who thrived on pushing debates into murky waters just to see who would sink and who would swim. Today's discussion was about media ethics, a topic that had already sparked lukewarm arguments across the room. Some students were still engaged, voices rising and falling as they tossed around theories about journalistic responsibility. Others had checked out, eyes drifting to the clock, willing time to move faster. But then, Ms. Whitmore did what she always did when a discussion started losing steam. She threw gasoline on the fire. "You see," she said, her voice smooth, almost casual. "The problem with modern journalism is that it's no longer about the truth. It's about selling a story. Some journalists care more about stirring controversy than reporting facts. Take someone like Celeste Carter, for example. A ripple went through the classroom. A few students chuckled, some exchanged glances, but most turned toward Jordan, waiting for a reaction. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But inside, something tightened. Something coiled. He had been here before, heard his mother's name dismissed, reduced to a punchline by people who had never met her, by people who had no idea what it cost her to do her job. He could already predict how this would play out. Ms. Whitmore would go on, weaving a narrative where his mother was the villain, the manipulator, the journalist who pushed an agenda. The students who already believed it would nod along. The ones who didn't care would stay silent. And Jordan would be expected to do the same. Ms. Whitmore leaned against her desk, flipping through the textbook, though everyone knew she wasn't reading from it. "She thrives on sensationalism," she continued, her gaze flickering toward Jordan, testing, provoking. "She stokes division under the guise of truth-seeking. But let's be honest, she's not interested in facts. She's interested in attention." A soft laugh from the back. A student shifting uncomfortably in their seat. The air in the room changed. Jordan felt it, the slow, almost imperceptible shift from detached discussion to something more. He kept his hands folded over his notebook, his breathing even, his face unreadable. It wasn't the first time he had heard these accusations. He had watched newscasters try to tear his mother apart on television, read the online articles accusing her of bias, seen the hate-filled messages sent to her inbox. But knowing it wasn't new didn't make it sting any less. The hardest part wasn't hearing the words. It was knowing that some people believed them. Ms. Whitmore straightened, slowly pacing again, her voice never rising, never breaking its controlled rhythm. Journalism today isn't about the truth anymore. It's about drama, scandals, outrage, and people like Celeste Carter. They don't inform, they perform. Jordan could hear his pulse in his ears, steady, controlled, like a drumbeat before a battle. He could feel the weight of the stairs, the unspoken challenge in the air. Ms. Whitmore was watching him now, waiting, daring him to react. If he stayed silent, she would take it as surrender. If he spoke, she would be ready to shut him down. He had seen it happen before. Students who thought they could challenge her only to be methodically dismantled, left floundering in front of their peers. He glanced at the clock. 12 minutes left in class. A few more sentences, and she would move on. A few more minutes, and he could walk out. Let it slide. Pretend it didn't matter. But the problem with silence is that it made people think you had nothing to say. And that was a mistake. Jordan exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing just a little harder against the cover of his notebook. He had a choice. And today, he wasn't staying silent. The room felt different now, charged with an unspoken tension that crackled in the air like static before a storm. Ms. Whitmore continued pacing, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her expression unreadable but her intent clear. She wasn't just discussing journalism anymore. She was making a point, and Jordan's mother was the example she had chosen to prove it. The class had caught on. Some students smirked, entertained by the spectacle of watching their teacher prod at something personal, waiting to see if Jordan would crack. Others avoided looking at him, sensing the fine line that had just been crossed. But Ms. Whitmore wasn't done yet. She thrived in these moments, in the delicate dance between intellectual debate and calculated provocation. She's a perfect example of what happens when you prioritize headlines over integrity. She continued smoothly, turning another page in the textbook she wasn't actually reading. You stop being a journalist and start being a performer. You don't inform. You entertain. You don't seek truth. You seek controversy. A soft chuckle from the back of the room, a flicker of amusement on a few faces. But not everyone was laughing. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at Jordan, then back at their desks. They weren't sure where this was going, but they knew it wasn't just an academic discussion anymore. It was personal. And Jordan knew it too. He had spent years watching his mother fight to be taken seriously in newsrooms where people like her weren't supposed to succeed. He had seen the exhaustion in her eyes after nights spent poring over documents, double-checking every fact, knowing that if she got even one small detail wrong, people like Ms. Whitmore would use it to discredit everything she had ever worked for. He had heard the phone calls, the threats, the anonymous messages telling her to stop digging, to stop asking questions, to stop telling the truth. And now, here he was, sitting in a classroom full of students who would one day inherit positions of power, listening to his mother's name being dismissed as if she were nothing more than a sensationalist chasing views. Jordan kept his posture straight, his hands still folded neatly on his notebook, but his jaw tightened slightly. He had learned early on that reacting emotionally gave people ammunition. That silence, in the right moments, could be just as powerful as words. But silence had its limits. He could feel it now, the growing weight of expectation in the room, the waiting, the anticipation. Ms. Whitmore was watching him, her voice even and unhurried, her words sharp without ever needing to rise in volume. She had been doing this for years, long enough to know exactly how to push students into uncomfortable spaces, to make them reveal more than they intended. Jordan glanced at the clock. 8 minutes left. He could let it slide, let her talk, let them laugh. He had done it before, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way she had said his mother's name with that casual smirk, like she was nothing more than a lesson to be dissected. Maybe it was the way the room had gone so still, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if he would finally break his silence. Or maybe he was just tired. tired of hearing people who had never sacrificed anything talk about those who had given up everything for the truth. Tired of watching powerful voices twist narratives to fit their own convenience. Tired of pretending that it didn't bother him. Ms. Whitmore checked the clock, her smirk deepening slightly, as if she had already decided that the moment was over. "And when you build a career on controversy," she continued, her voice slow and deliberate, "you shouldn't be surprised when people stop respecting you." Silence. A silence so dense it felt like the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of her words. Jordan could hear the subtle shifts of students in their seats, the rustle of paper, the almost imperceptible sound of someone holding their breath. It was the kind of silence that expected something, that demanded something. And Jordan, for the first time today, exhaled slowly and lifted his head. He didn't slam his notebook closed. He didn't shove his chair back. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood, the movement quiet but deliberate, the kind that made people pay attention without understanding why. The class collectively stilled. Even those who had been laughing moments ago were now silent, eyes flickering between Jordan and Ms. Whitmore, sensing the shift in power. She had expected him to sit there and take it. She had expected silence. But silence wasn't an option anymore. "With all due respect, Ms. Whitmore," Jordan said, his voice calm but unwavering, "you don't know what you're talking about." The smirk vanished. For the first time since the class had started, Ms. Whitmore hesitated. It was brief. Just a flicker in her expression, a slight pause before she adjusted her stance. But Jordan saw it, and so did everyone else. "My mother doesn't sell narratives," he continued, his tone steady, measured, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "She reports on stories that powerful people don't want exposed. Stories that make people uncomfortable. And yeah, that makes her unpopular. But being disliked by people in power isn't proof that she's wrong. Sometimes it's proof that she's right." Someone shifted in their seat, the quietest sound, but in the thick silence, it felt deafening. Jordan held Ms. Whitmore's gaze, unflinching. "You say she's just looking for attention," he went on. "But you weren't there when we had to move because of death threats. You weren't there when she worked through the night, fact-checking every word of her article, because if she got one thing wrong, people like you would use it to discredit everything she's ever done." The room was frozen. Even the students, who had chuckled earlier, weren't laughing now. Jordan let the words settle, let the weight of them press against the carefully controlled atmosphere of the classroom. Then he did something that no one, not even Ms. Whitmore, had expected. He sat back down. He didn't argue further. He didn't press. He didn't need to. Because sometimes, the truth didn't need to be shouted. It just needed to be said. The silence that followed was different this time. Heavy, charged, like the seconds after a lightning strike when the air is still humming with electricity. Jordan sat with the same quiet composure he had when he stood, his hands folded over, his notebook, his breathing even. But the entire class felt the shift. Students who had been slouched in their seats were suddenly sitting upright, eyes darting between him and Ms. Whitmore. The ones who had laughed earlier weren't laughing now. The ones who had been zoning out were suddenly paying attention. And Ms. Whitmore, always so quick, so sharp, always in control of the room, stood motionless, her expression unreadable. But Jordan saw the hesitation, brief as it was. For the first time all semester, she had no immediate retort. The bell should have saved her. It rang out, sharp and sudden, signaling the end of class. Normally, this would be the moment when students would push back their chairs, gather their things, flood toward the door in a rush to escape the weight of academia. But no one moved. The usual chaos of books, closing, and chairs scraping against the floor never came. The entire room remained frozen, as if waiting to see what Ms. Whitmore would do, how she would reclaim the authority that, for the first time, she seemed to have lost. She cleared her throat, subtle but telling. "That's all for today," she said, her voice controlled but lacking the usual edge. But still, no one moved. The bell had rung, but the class wasn't over. Not really. Jordan didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply reached for his bag, slipping his notebook inside, moving with the same unshaken certainty he had carried throughout the entire exchange. He knew what had just happened. Ms. Whitmore had expected to control the narrative, to steer the conversation in a way that forced him into silence or made him falter. But instead, she had miscalculated. She had underestimated him. And in doing so, she had lost the upper hand. He stood again, this time not to speak but to leave. He had said what needed to be said. That should have been the end of it. But just as he reached for the strap of his bag, her voice stopped him. "Jordan." He paused, his fingers tightening slightly, but he didn't turn around right away. He let the silence stretch a moment longer, just enough to tip the power balance further, before finally lifting his gaze to meet hers. She studied him, her expression unreadable. But there was something new in her voice, something that hadn't been there before. "You make some strong points," she said carefully, measuring each word. But journalism isn't just about uncovering the truth. It's about how that truth is delivered. A murmur rippled through the class. She wasn't letting this go. Jordan tilted his head slightly, waiting. She crossed her arms, regaining some of her usual sharpness. "Your mother is a skilled writer," she admitted, though the words seemed to cost her something. But when the way a story is told causes more division than understanding, at what point do we ask if it's doing more harm than good? Silence. A different kind this time. Not the stunned silence of before, but the kind that came when a question forced people to reconsider their stance. Jordan didn't rush his response. He let the weight of her words settle, let the tension breathe, before he spoke. "Are you asking that about all journalists?" he said finally, his voice steady. "Or just the ones who say things you don't like?" A sharper murmur this time. A few exchanged glances. A couple of students stiffened. Ms. Whitmore didn't react right away. For the first time, she was the one who let the silence stretch. Then, the second bell rang, the one that meant anyone still sitting would be late to their next class. The spell broke. Ms. Whitmore straightened, her usual composure snapping back into place like a mask being adjusted. "We'll continue this discussion next time," she said briskly. But everyone knew they wouldn't. Jordan didn't linger. He slung his bag over his shoulder and turned toward the door. But before he stepped out, a voice called after him. "Yo, Jordan?" He turned. It was Devin, one of the few students in the class who actually participated in discussions rather than just observing. He wasn't smiling, wasn't smirking, just watching him with an expression that Jordan couldn't quite place. Devin hesitated, then gave a small nod. "That was solid, man." Jordan raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the comment. He and Devin weren't exactly friends, but they weren't enemies either. Just two people who existed in the same space. Still, Jordan could tell when a moment was genuine. He nodded back. "Appreciate it." A few other students murmured in agreement. Some avoided his gaze, unsure of what to think now. But it didn't matter. Jordan hadn't been looking for approval. He had been looking for truth. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had said exactly what needed to be said. The hallway outside room 214 was alive with movement. Students spilling out of classrooms, voices overlapping, sneakers scuffing against the floor in the usual after-class chaos. But Jordan barely heard any of it. His mind was still in that room, still replaying the moment he stood up, the words he chose, the silence that followed. He wasn't afraid of speaking up. His mother hadn't raised him to be. But this wasn't like other moments. This wasn't just an argument over policy or historical facts. This was personal. He adjusted the strap of his bag, weaving through the crowd. He figured he'd eat lunch alone today, take a moment to process everything before having to deal with it again tomorrow. But then, yo, Jordan. He turned again. This time, it wasn't just Devin. A few other students from class were, with him, falling into step beside him. Devin shook his head with a small grin. You really caught her off guard back there. I've never seen Ms. Whitmore hesitate like that. Nathan, another student, smirked. Bro, I thought she was about to flame you, but you flipped the whole thing on her. Jordan shrugged. I just said what needed to be said. Devin scoffed. Yeah, but most people wouldn't have. Jordan glanced at him, then at the others. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking alone. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime noise. Laughter, trays clattering, conversations overlapping in a dull roar. Jordan sat at his usual table near the courtyard, where he could eat in peace, away from the clusters of students who had their own social hierarchies to navigate. He had expected to sit alone today, to have time to process everything before he had to step back into another classroom. But that wasn't what happened. Devin and a few others from class had followed him, casually taking seats around his table, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't. Jordan had never been the type to draw a crowd, and he definitely hadn't expected today to change that. But here they were, and the conversation hadn't stopped since they left room 214. You really shook her, man, Devin said, leaning back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. I mean, I've seen people push back against Ms. Whitmore before, but not like that. You actually made her pause. Nathan, sitting across from Jordan, smirked. Yeah, I thought she was about to tear you apart, but you flipped the whole thing on her. Jordan took a slow sip of his drink, not rushing to respond. He wasn't sure how to feel about all the attention. He hadn't spoken up to impress anyone. He had done it because he was tired. Tired of hearing people reduce his mother to a soundbite. Tired of letting people like Ms. Whitmore control the narrative. Andre, another student, exhaled through his nose. Man, the way she was talking about your mom was straight up disrespectful. Like, she thought you weren't gonna say anything. Jordan set his drink down. She thought I'd let it slide. Devin tilted his head, curious. And why didn't you? The question wasn't hostile, just genuine. Jordan considered it for a moment, his gaze drifting past the courtyard, past the groups of students laughing and scrolling through their phones, completely removed from what had happened in that classroom. Then he exhaled. Because I'm tired, he admitted. Tired of people acting like telling the truth is the real crime. Like it's more dangerous to report on injustice than to be the injustice. Like the real problem is the people exposing corruption, not the ones committing it. The group went quiet. Not the awkward kind of quiet, but the kind that meant people were thinking. Jordan continued, his voice steady. My mom doesn't go after people just to stir up controversy. She goes after them because no one else will. And yeah, she's pissed off a lot of powerful people. But if the worst thing they can say about her is that she's too loud, then that just means they don't have anything real on her. Devin nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. That makes sense. Nathan grinned. I mean, I wasn't gonna say anything in class, but I'm glad you did. That took guts. Jordan let out a quiet chuckle. I wasn't trying to be brave. I was just done letting people like her talk like that without being checked. Devin smirked. Same thing. The conversation shifted after that. Basketball, homework, weekend plans, normal things. But Jordan noticed something. They were walking with him now, sitting with him, acknowledging him in a way they hadn't before. Maybe it wasn't just about what he said. Maybe it was about the fact that he had said it at all. But the day wasn't over yet. As he was heading toward his last period, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and felt a small weight settle in his chest. A new email. Subject: a conversation. From Ms. Whitmore. Jordan hesitated in the middle of the hallway, students moving around him. The sound of lockers slamming and footsteps blending into background noise. He read the short message. Jordan, if you have a moment after school, I'd like to talk in my office. He debated ignoring it. He had already said everything he needed to say. As far as he was concerned, the conversation was over. But something about the message told him that this wasn't just about what had happened in class. And if there was one thing his mother had always taught him, it was this. Running from a conversation was the fastest way to let someone else control the story. So when the final bell rang, Jordan didn't head for the parking lot. He turned toward the faculty wing instead. Jordan walked down the quiet hallway toward the faculty offices, his footsteps steady, his mind already preparing for whatever came next. He didn't know exactly what Ms. Whitmore wanted, but he knew she wasn't the type to send an email like that without a reason. Maybe she wanted to defend herself, to regain the control she had lost in class. Maybe she wanted to double down, to frame her words as a lesson rather than an attack. Or maybe, just maybe, she had something else to say. He reached her door, hesitated for only a second, then knocked. Come in. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Ms. Whitmore's office was just as organized as her classroom. Bookshelves lined with political theory and legal texts, framed articles from major publications, and on the wall behind her desk, newspaper clipping about a landmark case involving press freedom. Jordan recognized it immediately. She gestured toward the chair across from her. Close the door. He did, then sat, keeping his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Miss Whitmore studied him, her fingers interlocked, on the desk, her posture controlled, as always. But something was different. Her usual sharpness was still there, but the confidence behind it had shifted. Not weakened, recalibrated. You caught me off guard today, she said finally. Jordan didn't flinch. Yeah, I noticed, she exhaled. But it wasn't frustration. It was something closer to thoughtfulness. I've been a teacher for a long time, she continued. I push students to think critically, to challenge ideas, to question their own biases. But I also recognize when I've miscalculated. That caught Jordan off guard. He had expected her to justify herself, to defend her approach, not to admit she might have been wrong. She leaned back slightly. I still believe the press has a responsibility to be careful with how they present information, and I won't apologize for questioning that. Jordan crossed his arms. I didn't ask you to. She nodded, as if she had expected that response. Then, after a brief pause, she tilted her head slightly. But I will say this. You made me reconsider how I framed today's discussion. I wasn't just talking about your mother's work. I was talking about her, and that wasn't fair. Jordan didn't respond right away. He studied her, looking for any sign that she was only saying what she thought he wanted to hear. But there was no smirk, no condescending tone, just a straightforward acknowledgement of what had happened. After a beat, he asked, Why did you bring her up in the first place? Ms. Whitmore didn't look away. Because she's one of the most controversial journalists working today. Because people either admire her or despise her. Because she represents the exact divide I was trying to get students to analyze. She paused. But I should have acknowledged that she's also a person, not just a topic for debate. Jordan exhaled slowly. It wasn't an apology. Not really. But it was something. I wasn't trying to prove a point today, he said after a moment. I was just done listening to people talk about my mom like she's some one-dimensional figure. Like she doesn't wake up every day knowing that telling the truth makes her a target. Ms. Whitmore nodded. That's something a lot of people don't think about. Jordan shrugged. They don't have to. Because they're not the ones living it. She leaned back. considering his words. "You're a sharp kid, Jordan. You've got your mother's fire." He smirked slightly. "Yeah, I hear that a lot." She gestured toward the door. "Go on, I won't keep you." Jordan stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder. But just before he walked out, he paused. Then, without turning around, he said, "Next time you want to use her as an example." He met her gaze. "Maybe ask yourself if you're questioning the integrity of her work, or just the fact that she makes people uncomfortable." Ms. Whitmore didn't respond right away. And this time, she didn't have a smirk to hide behind. Jordan didn't wait for an answer. He walked out, leaving the door open behind him. The drive home was quiet, the city bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun. Jordan's hands rested on the wheel, his mind still turning over the events of the day. He had walked into that classroom expecting just another debate. Another moment where he'd have to swallow his frustration and let people say whatever they wanted. But today had been different. Today, he had spoken, and people had listened. When he pulled into the driveway, his mother's car was already there. Through the window, he could see her at the dining table, her laptop open, a pen tapping against a notebook as she reviewed notes, deep in thought. It was a sight he had grown up with. His mother, always working, always chasing the truth, no matter the cost. He stepped inside, dropping his bag by the door. She looked up, studying him with the sharp gaze of someone who could read a room before a single word was spoken. "Long day?" Jordan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." She didn't push, just gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit with me for a bit." He did, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like she'd be proud of what he did today. Because the truth was, people would always try to discredit those who challenged the way things were. They'd call them biased, reckless, dangerous. They'd twist their words, turn the spotlight against them, make them the villains in stories where they were only trying to expose the real ones. But in the end, the people who changed the world weren't the ones who stayed silent. They were the ones who spoke, even when their voice was the only one in the room. So, the next time someone tries to dismiss the truth, ask yourself, who really benefits from the silence? And then decide what kind of person you want to be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, would you have spoken up if you were in Jordan's place? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.